Hello, everybody. It's good to be back. We had a little run in with COVID last week. Someone that we spend time with was sick and they tested positive. And so then we started feeling sick. So we took the test too, and it was positive. And it was a little funny because I called my doctor's office to schedule my annual physical, which is coming up. And then I said, well, I have COVID. Could the PA call me so maybe I could get some antiviral medication or something? Uh, they said they would ask. And later they called back and said, well, he doesn't have any time, so you should go to urgent care if you need anything. Well, Brenda, my wife, had a virtual meeting scheduled with the doctor. And so I was sitting there while she was having this virtual meeting. And at the end, the doctor said, well, what about Andy? Does he need anything? And Brenda said, well, sure. And so we both got the prescription for the antiviral medication. And I don't know if it helped, but you have to start taking it right away. And we didn't want to wait around to see what happened. But it does go to show who has pull around my house with the doctor's office, anyways. Uh, but we never really got terribly sick, but we were sick enough that we knew we were sick and we would run out of gas by the end of the day. So we just kind of sat around not doing much for 4 or 5 days. Uh, but we're back on the job now. And in today's passage, 1 Samuel 13, 1 to 14, we'll see how King Saul handles a stressful situation that was brought about by something that his son did. And so we'll see how the stresses of life and head slapping decisions can lead us to foolishly obey God's commands. So that's 1 Samuel 13, 1 to 14. And I have the Net Bible, New English Translation today. So it says, Saul was 30 years old when he began to reign. He ruled over Israel for 40 years. Saul selected for himself 3,000 men from Israel. Of these, 2,000 were with Saul at Michmash and in the hill country of Bethel. The remaining 1,000 were with Jonathan at Gibeah in the territory of Benjamin. He sent all of the rest of the people back home. Jonathan attacked the Philistine outpost that was at Gibeah, and the Philistines heard about it. Then Saul alerted all the land, saying, let the Hebrews pay attention. All Israel heard this message. Saul has attacked the Philistine outpost, and now Israel is repulsive to the Philistines. So the people were summoned to join Saul at Gilgal. Meanwhile, the Philistines gathered to battle with Israel. Then they went up against Israel with 3,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and an army as numerous as the sand on the seashore. They went up and camped at Michmash, east of Beth Aven. The men of Israel realized they had a problem because their army was hard pressed. So the army hid in caves, thickets, cliffs, strongholds, and cisterns. Some of the Hebrews crossed over the Jordan River to the land of Gad and Gilead, but Saul stayed at Gilgal. The entire army that was with him was terrified. He waited for 7 days, the time period indicated by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the army began to abandon Saul. So Saul said, bring me the burnt offering and the peace offerings. Then he offered a burnt offering. Just when he had finished offering the burnt offering, Samuel appeared on the scene. Saul went out to meet him and greet him. But Samuel said, what have you done? Saul replied, when I saw that the army had started to abandon me and that you didn't come at the appointed time, and that the Philistines had assembled at Michmash, I thought, now the Philistines will come down on me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the Lord's favor. So I felt obligated to offer the burnt offering. Then Samuel said to Saul, you have made a foolish choice. You have not obeyed the commandment that the Lord your God gave you. Had you done that, the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom will not continue. The Lord has sought out for himself a man who is loyal to him, and the Lord has appointed him to be leader over his people. For you have not obeyed what the Lord commanded you. So in the first section there, verses 1 to 8, we see what some commentators call a head-slapping decision by Saul's son Jonathan to attack the Philistines. That made me think of the old V8 commercial where somebody was drinking water, and then after he was done, he said, "Oh, I could have had a V8." So that's a head-slapping decision. Now, Saul hasn't been king very long, and he's selected 3,000 men to be his army. And 2,000 of these stay with Saul at Michmash, and 100 are with Jonathan at Gibeah. And these men are apparently stationed so they can defend the homeland against an attack. And this is the first mention of Jonathan, who was Saul's son, and he would be next in line to be king. Previously, Israel had no army, but and the men would come together as a militia when there was need to fight a battle or defend the country. Well, now they have a king, and he has established an army, a standing army, but he sends the rest of the people back home. And if we remember back, they had gotten together, all the people at Gilgal, to renew the kingship after Saul had defeated the Ammonites. Now, for some reason, Jonathan goes out and attacks the Philistine outpost in Gibeah. And there's some indication in the language that he attacked a single person. So perhaps he attacked and killed or injured the commander at this garrison in Gibeah. Well, naturally, the Philistines hear about this, as did Saul. And so Saul tells the Israelites, the Hebrews, to pay attention. And then he sends a message. And the message he sends is that Saul has attacked the outpost, and now Israel is repulsive to the Philistines. Saul apparently is responsible because he is the king. The people are summoned to join Saul at Gilgal to prepare for and defend an attack by the Philistines. Well, the Philistines far outnumber the Israelites. They have 3,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen, not to mention an army as numerous as the sand on the seashore. It's very large. And Saul has this standing army of 3,000 men, plus whatever rest of the people that come. Well, the Israelites realize they have a big problem going up against this enemy, and so they start hiding out wherever they can. The army starts hiding out wherever they can. Some even cross over to the other side of the Jordan River to escape this attack. So that was quite a head-slapping decision by Jonathan, and it puts Saul in a very bad spot. Saul stays at Gilgal, and if we remember back to chapter 10:8, Samuel had instructed Saul, "You will go down to Gilgal before me. I'm going to join you there to offer burnt offerings and to make peace offerings. You should wait 7 days until I arrive and tell you what to do." So that was the command: go to Gilgal and wait for 7 days until I arrive, and then I will tell you what to do. But Samuel does not come, and the army begins to abandon Saul. So Saul is put in a really tight spot by Jonathan's decision to attack this Philistine outpost, and then Samuel's delay in arriving at Gilgal. And so he goes ahead and makes a bad decision of his own. And it says in verses 9 to 12, So Saul says, "Bring me the burnt offerings and the peace offerings." And then he offered a burnt offering. And just when he has finished offering the burnt offering, Samuel appeared on the scene. And Saul went out to meet him and to greet him. But Samuel says, "What have you done?" Saul replies, "When I saw that the army had started to abandon me and that you didn't come at the appointed time and that the Philistines had assembled at Michmash, I thought, now the Philistines will come down on me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the Lord's favor. So I felt obligated to offer the burnt offerings." So instead of waiting for Samuel as he had been instructed, Saul gets ready to make the burnt offerings. Uh, Now, this was bad not only because he didn't wait for Samuel, but because he took on the role of a priest in making the offering, and that was not allowed. He was the king, not a priest. And so, in a time of great stress, we have to give Saul a little bit of break. He was under a great deal of stress, but he took shortcuts instead of waiting on God and on God's designated prophet, priest, judge, Samuel, as he had been commanded to do. So he makes the offering, the burnt offering. And apparently he didn't get to the peace offering because Samuel arrives. And Saul goes out to say hi to Samuel, not thinking apparently that he had done anything wrong. Samuel is not happy and says, "What have you done?" Well, Saul starts laying the blame on others. Well, first, the army had started to abandon him, and so obviously he had to do something. And then Samuel didn't arrive at the appointed time. Now, Samuel had said, "Wait 7 days until I arrive." And it looked like Saul had waited 7 days, but he didn't wait until Samuel arrived. Third, the Philistines were assembling to attack. And so, how possibly could Saul wait any longer to make the offering? And finally, he suggests that he was only trying to honor God by seeking his favor. Therefore, he felt obligated to offer the burnt offerings. And the word here for obligated literally means to force oneself or to pluck up courage. The NASB has, "I worked up the courage to make the offering." The NIV says, "I felt compelled to make the offering." And so it's not really Saul's fault. He only did what he had to do, given how everything had turned against him. And so this is a reflection on Saul's poor character and his lack of faith and reliance on God, maybe his confidence in God, rather than trusting that Samuel would arrive and then God would intervene to help him and help Israel defend this attack by the Philistines. He goes ahead and does what seems right in his own eyes. So Saul's faith was in his human army, and they were abandoning him. And so he reasoned that he should make this offering and seek God's favor. And so he was compelled to make the offering. He worked up the courage to do it. He just did what he had to do. And how often have we said that? Well, Samuel is not going to go along with Saul's excuses, and so he tells him about the consequences of his foolish choice to disobey God's commands. And it says in verses 13 to 14, then Samuel says to Saul, "You have made a foolish choice. You have not obeyed the commandment that God, the Lord your God, gave you. Had you done that, the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom will not continue. The Lord has sought out for himself a man who is loyal to him, and the Lord has appointed him to be leader over his people. For you have not obeyed what the Lord commanded you." Well, because Saul did not obey God's command, the kingdom is going to be taken away from him and given to someone else, someone who is loyal to God. And loyal to God is someone who is after God's own heart. And we'll hear that description again in the future. The phrase, "you have not obeyed what the Lord commanded you," is repeated. And so it goes deeper than that, because Saul lacked faith in God and judged the situation based on what he saw. Someone who is loyal to God will judge such situations by faith and remain loyal to God. He will obey God's commands even when the going gets tough. But it's not a matter of legalistically obeying the commands. It's about obeying the commands out of a heart of faith and loyalty to God. Saul failed on both accounts. He didn't obey the commands, but he didn't obey that because he lacked faith in God and he didn't have loyalty to God. And so the problem is not simply failing to obey God's commands. It's that we don't obey God's commands, and that shows that we lack faith in God and we lack loyalty to God. So really, the situation turns out to be a test of Saul's faith. And so God arranged or allowed Jonathan to attack this garrison of the Philistines. And then he arranged for Samuel to be a little bit late. And that put Saul in a bind. And how was Saul going to respond to being in this bad spot? Well, he acted out of his fallen humanity instead of acting out of faith in God. And that was the real failure. If he had waited for Samuel and obeyed God's command, God would have helped him defeat the Philistines, and he would have established Samuel's kingdom over Israel forever. Saul's disobedience and lack of faith results in him being rejected as king. But he does continue to rule for many years. He just does this out of his own power, on his own ability. And at times, it is not very pretty, as we'll see. Well, we also are going to face tests from time to time. And James writes in the New Testament, "My brothers and sisters, consider it nothing but joy when you fall into all sorts of trials, because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect effect, so that you will be perfect and complete, not deficient in anything." And so, on the one hand, God will test people to see whether their faith is genuine. And this is what happened to Saul. Since God is omniscient, he knows everything. He already knows whether our faith is true and genuine or not, and even whether we'll pass the test. So if we find out that we are failing this test over and over again, we have to look in the mirror and ask ourselves if our faith is genuine. In 2 Corinthians 13:5, Paul writes, "Put yourself to the test to see if you are in the faith. Examine yourselves. Or do you not recognize regarding yourselves that Jesus Christ is in you, unless indeed you fail the test?" And Peter writes in 2 Peter 1:10 or 1:10, "Therefore, brothers and sisters, make every effort to be sure of your calling and election, for by doing this you will never stumble into sin." Now, I'm not saying we have to get up every morning and question whether or not we are saved. We should be able to have confidence and security in our salvation if we made the decision to trust Jesus. But if we aren't able to recognize that Christ is in us, then we should pray and talk with a spiritual leader, our pastor, or other trusted Christian, and see if we can have the confidence that comes with finding salvation. On the other hand, as James writes, God will test those who do have genuine faith in order to produce endurance so that we can mature toward perfection and completeness. And so this was the difference between Saul and David, in David's early years at least. Saul lacked faith and did things out of his own strength, while David was a man after God's own heart, and he trusted God. He put his trust in God, his faith in God. He relied on God, and God helped him and saved him and was with him in everything that David did. So remember, if you are facing a difficult situation because of your own head slap decision or one that someone else has made, don't take the shortcuts that seem right to you at the present time. As Charles Stanley says, or used to say, obey God and leave all the consequences up to Him. All right, well, thank you for tuning in today. Let's have a word of prayer, and then we could have a song before we go. So join me in prayer. Father, thank you for the examples of Saul and David and Samuel here in the book of 1 Samuel. Thank you for testing us, not only to help us find out if we are in the faith, if Jesus is in us, but also to grow our faith, to give us endurance, to make it through the difficult pressures of life, to grow and mature, to become more like Christ. Help us each to know the difference, and if we find that we are not in the faith, that we will take that step, make the decision to put our faith in Jesus, and then obey you and leave all the consequences up to you. And we pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, here is a song, and then I'll be back in a minute. When we walk with the Lord in the light of His word, what a glory He sheds on our way. While we do His good will, He abides with us still, and with all who will trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey. Not a burden we bear, not a sorrow we share, but our toil He doth richly repay. Not a grief nor a loss, not a frown nor a cross, but is blessed if we trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey. But we never can prove the delights of His love until all on the altar we lay. For the favor He shows and the joy He bestows are for them who will trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey. Then in fellowship sweet we will sit at His feet, or will walk by His side in the way. What He says we will do, where He sends we will go. Never fear, only trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey. All right. Well, thanks for tuning in when you could, and hope you have a great week and stay away from the COVID if you can. We'll see you next time. Bye bye.